looking at. Let's just say, for example, that we're seeing something in our minds. Maybe it's a memory, maybe it's a plan, fantasy, whatever it is, we're watching it in our minds. And let's say that we don't want it to be arising in our minds and we are resisting it. Well, we could say that this skill, the allow skill, isn't fully developed. That's one way about it. And so we're going to keep that over here and look at these. So we're resisting it. We're fighting against it. There's a battle within ourselves. There's friction between our experience, within our relationship with our experience. There's friction. So if we were to imagine bringing this skill in, then we would be allowing ourselves to see something within. We'd be allowing that experience to occur. And in so doing, a great deal of suffering would be resolved. Now, we can look at this in a little bit more detail. We can split this apart, so we'll take this over here and this over here, and we'll even do this crazy thing here, and take that and make another one. And so now we're going to have both kinds of allowing. What does that mean? Well, that means that within this experience here, we are allowing this experience to arise, to come into our awareness, and we're allowing this experience to pass out of our awareness, allowing it to arise and to pass away. When that happens, then we work through the difficulty of this arising, because we're not resisting it anymore. We allow it to arise. And so even if it's a difficult thing that we're envisioning in our minds, it won't cause us suffering. We're not resisting it, so it can't cause us suffering. We're okay with it arising. But what's very interesting is that a lot of the time, when we have trouble with something, we have a lot of trouble letting it go. We get into the habit often of having a difficult experience. We get used to it, and so there are times when it tends to start to pass away, but we actually cling to it. Sometimes we even base our identity upon it. We consciously consider ourselves to be inherently associated with that experience. We don't let it pass away. And in that way, we cause a great deal of suffering. We cause suffering when it's arising, if we don't have this skill, and we cause suffering when it's passing away, when we don't have this skill. Either way, it causes suffering. But when we can take these together, let's say that we do it this way, for example. Maybe that's a good way to envision it. We can have this skill set here working with this experience here, then suffering cannot arise and the experience suddenly becomes quite valuable. We can learn from it. It can purify us. And coming to the point of experiencing that purification, of allowing a difficult experience to arise and pass away, this is one of the great spiritual and personal transformational experiences of mindfulness. Now, we can also imagine that this is a pleasant situation. The seeing in may be something we like a lot. Would this make sense then? Maybe we don't want to allow it. Maybe we want to hold on to it. Well, in fact, that doesn't work either. It still makes sense to have this skill. Why is that? Well, it makes sense because as it's arising, we want to let it arise. By clinging to it, holding on to it tightly, we actually prevent it from moving through its full life cycle, from being truly fulfilling to us. And if we hold on to it, then the purification that can come through a positive experience also doesn't occur. We don't have the experience of letting it go. And because we don't have that experience, it stops moving through us freely, purifying us and fulfilling us, and instead becomes an addiction. When we have an addictive experience, it's because it's very pleasant, but we're not letting it go. That's, I should say, one part of an addictive experience. We'll talk more later about that complex phenomenon. So that is this particular situation. I'm sure you can imagine the fact that the same would be true of imagining something in your mind, and in particular it's true of emotional sensations. When we have emotional sensations within, it's very common that we don't have this skill set. And when we can develop this skill set, when all of these are put together, that makes a big difference in our lives. Most people have very little skill, I'm sorry to say, and human history is more or less defined by a lack of skill in allowing in and allowing out our emotional experience, the internal feelings in our bodies. And so this is the basis of becoming a mature person and ultimately becoming a mature society. Let's again say that we have an emotional experience, just for example. So here's our emotional experience. What would it be like if we were to focus on it? You're having some emotion. Let's say it's a positive emotion. If you can focus on that emotion, then what does that mean? It means that everything else is excluded. All of your attention that arises in each moment is brought to this experience. So, how does that work? We move from an experience that we don't receive a rich, full, complete sensory impact from, and we do receive a rich, full sensory impact when everything else is excluded from our attention and 100% of our attention goes onto this. What else happens? Once we've done that, we can then focus in on it and see it for what it really is. We can see it more and more deeply. We can see that experience with clarity. Through that experience, we can come to know ourselves. We can come to know what it is that has made us. We can come to know its deeper meaning. Now, let's say for fun that in this experience, just for fun, let's say that we have the ability to focus out and in, and we have the ability to allow in and out. Let's just say that we've got all of this. And we have this experience. Well, the first thing that I'd want to say is that suffering within that experience, whether it's a pleasant one or a painful one, suffering there cannot arise. Use the experience of a pleasant one before. Let's talk about a painful one. A painful experience, perhaps you're sad. You're focusing completely on that. Everything else is excluded. That sadness suddenly becomes strangely meaningful. It's mysterious, but it happens. I often talk to teens about this because I notice that teens, when they've had, for example, a breakup with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, listen to sad music. Now isn't that strange? They listen to sad music when they're sad. Why? Well, because the sad music is helping them to focus on the experience of being sad. And as it helps them to focus on that experience of sadness, the sadness itself gains a kind of meaning. It gains a kind of substance, which is satisfying. And, interestingly enough, sometimes fulfilling. We often watch TV shows or movies about this sort of thing because we find it fulfilling to get that impact of real sadness. Why is that? Because of the fulfillment that is involved in deep concentration on something. Once you can concentrate on it, you can clarify what it is. You can see more clearly what that sadness is. And that sadness is often highly significant. People often gain a great deal of insight about the nature of themselves, their lives, the world, through those intense experiences. That's why we often say that those experiences help us to grow, help us to mature, build our character. What else happens? Well, let's say that this person has an excellent ability to allow this experience in. They're not resisting it at all. So the sadness arises, but they're not resisting it. Then it's just sadness. It doesn't become suffering. I would say that suffering is meaningless, but the emotional pain of sadness is meaningful. Suffering is not useful. Sadness is. Sadness has a purpose. Suffering does not. Once we've worked through it, we've found the taste of concentration, the taste of clarity, and we've allowed it to fully arise. At that time, it naturally passes away. We don't need to identify with it as it's passing away. And so that suffering also doesn't arise because we have this skill, the allowing it out skill. We're allowing it to pass away. We let it go. And in letting it go, a deep satisfaction arises. A deep satisfaction of knowing that we are always completely whole and full. Perfect, with or without that experience. That can occur when we let it go. So we have all of these skills. We've now dealt skillfully with this experience, and an important question arises. Well, what happens to that experience? One thing that it often becomes is flow. It becomes a kind of moving energy that we can experience deeply. It becomes very fulfilling. Our bodies change and become full of a kind of a vibrating, scintillating, expanding, contracting, magnificent stream of activity. It becomes very, very interesting, and suffering cannot come in. What else may happen? Well, as we do that, it's entirely possible that we'll suddenly, spontaneously enter a state of deep relaxation, of deep emotional peace. We focused on it, we have had insight into it, we've let it arise, and we've let it pass away. And in passing away, we attain an amazing and fulfilling internal peace. That may also be external. Our bodies may physically and emotionally deeply relax, and we can attain a kind of freedom which is incredibly pleasant. It's also possible that out of that experience of deep pain, magically compassion arises. We feel better. We feel good in an amazing way. And we can intentionally bring up thoughts of helping other people who are in pain. So these three superpowers are deeply enabled by having experience of feel when we have these skills. Of course, the same is true of things that we hear, and the same is true of things that we see. So these skills, in their various aspects,